Okay, so I told you last week we have 2 weeks of Reb Yaakov's Chochmas Yisrael, which he used to call Chochmas Yisrael, on like the Frum Maskilim, which there weren't so many of them, but the Frum Maskilim he didn't call them Chachmei Yisrael, but he used to say what they're osik in is Chochmas Yisrael. And one of those fellows I mentioned was Rav Fishel Bear, which we spoke about last week, and there's going to be another one this week as well. And the most famous one that I always hear quoted is the Maritz Chayes, right? I think his name was Maritz Chayes. I don't remember the name. Something maybe Reb Tzvi Chayes was his name.
It was like
CF, maybe was what?
This CF changes.
Yeah.
Right. So, the student's introduction to the Talmud.
Right. Exactly. He wrote he wrote a 2-volume work. It became a 2-volume work, but one of the parts of the volume is Mavola Talmud, which of course was translated into English. And there's tons of Chachmas Yisrael. But why? By the way, Rav Hutner's daughter, his daughter, Buria Zechanol Rocha, wrote a doctorate in Columbia on the Maritz Chayes.
Really?
Yeah, she called him, if I'm not mistaken, a Torah Maskil. That's what she called it. And you can get a hold of it. I never got it, but you get a hold of it at the Hebrew University, her doctorate. But in any event, so that there was a whole group like this that were what we call kosher maskilim, amongst the many non-kosher maskilim. So that we did last week with two things. One was with regard to Reb Yaakov himself spoke about Bizman Habayis, which appears in more than one place that you write that the Jewish people only Bizman Habayis, which means at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, right? In our case, it was Hayotze Meretz Yisrael Bizman Habayis, right? Which is a censor. It's censored. It's not. There's no such thing Hayotze Meretz Yisrael Bizman Habayis. In fact, I mentioned that I asked from David Cohen. That wasn't Zman Habayis. It was time of Shmuel. So what do you mean? So it was put in there so people would not get angry at the Jewish people. There could be a lot of different reasons what they were afraid of. My particular idea was that they were afraid of the Jewish people were not necessarily supposed to be living in Eretz Yisrael as far as the Christians, Muslims were concerned, and therefore they wrote Bizman Habayis. Then Reb Yaakov spoke about the difference between Mumar and Meshumad. Okay, that whenever it says Meshumad in Chazal, a lot of times it's switched for a Mumar, because the word Mumar, Meshumad, means someone who dropped the religion, who rebelled against the religion, Shmad, right? And that's a very harsh word, and therefore people didn't want to use that, so they used Mumar, which can be also, so that could have been changed by people in charge of printing. If there were Jews who were not from, but they didn't want the word to mean Meshumad, like Kol Benecha Lo Yochal Bo, which the Targum, the Targum that we should say Kol Meshumad, right? Lo Yochal Bo. However, what the word in Aramaic is. Which that's what we have in the new Chumashim from the last 20, 30 years. That's what we have. But if you look in Chumashim that I got for my bar mitzvah, it says something totally different. It doesn't even say Mumar. Over there, it says the word that we had was I think it was like something. The Masalik or something. 1 second. Yeah. Shalom Nachil Min HaPesach L'Ovid Kochavim was one of them. But there was another word that in some of the Chumashim, I think in one of my old Chumashim, you have it, where it's it says the mistalik or something like that. So it leaves out everything. But Reb Yaakov says that in many places they exchange mumar for meshumad, and in our Shmon Esrei, he says they exchanged la mishumadim for malshinim. Okay, malshinim is a separate category of people who report Jewish people, other Jewish people. So these mishumadim, I don't know if they necessarily did that, but usually mishumadim were the ones that exchanged their religion for Christianity. So already you see that in the Targum they use the word meshumad already, the yishtamed lo yochal bei by Pesach. So Reb Yaakov was basically saying that a lot of times you will find that when there's a harsh term used for a fellow who left the religion, it'll be changed, or if it has any sort of bearing on the non-Jews, it'll be changed. Mumar is a much less strong word. Mumar can mean a number of different things, so they would use that. So that's what Reb Yaakov was saying about meshumad and mumar. Okay, now Reb Yaakov continues on. But Reb Yaakov quotes somebody, right? You'll get a little bit of history over here. Somebody I don't think anyone ever heard. He was a Rav in America. Okay, he was a Rav in America, and I don't know if anyone ever heard of him. He was a big Gadol Batorah. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about him today, because Reb Yaakov sort of quotes him.
Now, can you just tell me where? Oh, can you just tell me where you are?
Tuf Mem Ches, towards the bottom.
Tuf Mem Ches.
Tuf Mem Ches, towards the bottom.
Okay.
And it's page 2, but from page 2 we go over to page 4 because page 3 was back in Chumash, so we have to go over to page 4. So that's Tuf Mem Ches and Tuf Mem Tes. I put in the middle of the Chumash because that's what we were doing. I just wanted to remind you that Rafishal Ber is the one that said that the fellow who printed the Warsaw edition of the Chumash, he printed the word mistalik, I think, instead of meshumad, because he became a meshumad. He actually became a meshumad, so he took out that word and changed the word. That's where Official Ber told Reb Yaakov that by the time that set got printed, he was already a meshumad. He already left Judaism. Okay, which there were no shortage of that in Eastern Europe at this time. Okay, so Tuf Mem Ches at the bottom left, V'davar zeh shamila makoris hu meshumid, right? That a lot of times the original word is meshumid, not mumar, not any other word, right? Not avodas kochavim, ovdei kochavim. It was meshumid, right? Katafti biyos b'tzitivyan. I wrote this when I was still the rabbi of Tzitivyan, L'Rav Moshe Shimon Zivitz. Okay, there was a fellow by the name of Reb Moshe Shimon Zivitz, Bala Machaber Sefer HaMashbich, or HaMashbiach, right? Al Yerushalmi. Okay, there's a 2-volume work from Reb Moshe Shimon Zivitz on the Yerushalmi. He loved Yerushalmi. He used to write Ha'oris on the Yerushalmi, right? Hu Haya Yelid Tzitivyan. Okay, he was born in Tzitivyan. Okay, so the minute you read this, you begin to think to yourself, "Oh, Reb Yaakov knew him because he was born in Tzitivyan, and then he became a big rabbi." Keep going. V'lachein sholach li es sifro. He sent me his sefer, which is called Sefer Hamashbiach, right? Shalom as Sifro, ubikesh men la'ir ha'oris al Sifro, and he asked Rabbi Yaakov to write ha'oris on his sefer on Yerushalmi. Avalo haya li Yerushalmi. In Tzitivyan we didn't have a Yerushalmi, so Rabbi Yaakov never saw Yerushalmi. Okay, Could be in Slobodka they had one set, right? So that's why Reb Yaakov knew Shas by Baal Peh, but Yerushalmi he didn't know Baal Peh. He learned through it at different times, but he didn't have it until he got to Canada or the United States. He didn't have Yerushalmi, okay? And in the Ha'ara, in 644, Reb Yosef quotes Reb Yaakov, Rabbeinu Tzachak v'omer shebekoshi Talmud Bavli. We had Bekoshi a Talmud Bavli in Sitivyan. Look, in a big city, of course you had, but in Sitivyan you didn't have a Yerushalmi, and Bekoshi had a Bavli. The Rav, I'm sure, had a Bavli, but I'm sure in the shul there wasn't even one set of Bavli in Sitivyan. You can't even imagine this because I don't know if a bar mitzvah boy gets a Yerushalmi today, but sometimes he goes away with 3 Bavlis, like the bigger one and the smaller one and this, right? So it's like a whole different world today. Okay.
But sure, and I can tell you on authority that in the Geniza, in front of the Shtibel and Ramat Beit Shemesh, every week, at least once a week, somebody throws away an entire shas.
Yeah. So a woman.
I check. I see.
A woman came into the school about 3 years ago, and she said, "Look, I have a Sensino shas. Would you want to borrow it from me?" So I said, "I got news for you. Okay, if I don't borrow it from you, nobody's going to take it. Okay, and I have one already. Okay, that someone brought to the school, and you'll be number 2." I said, "You're never going to come back. You're never going to come back to me with that and ask me for the shas back. You can forget it." And then I said to her, "Does your husband own a shas?" She said, "Yeah, and an art school shas." So I said, "You're definitely not going to come back to me. I'm doing you the biggest favor possible." Okay. Anyway, so Wayne is 100% right. It's crazy. I gave away svarim before I left the house because my kids, I told you, didn't take their svarim, their bar mitzvah svarim. And I couldn't fit them all in these bookcases here. So I said, "Listen, Shmuel, Yaakov, if you don't take it, I'm going to give it away." They didn't even blink, but nobody came. They were in mint condition. Nobody came. Once in a while, a person came, Nebuch and this and that, right? But mamish, nobody came. It's a crazy world we live in today. Okay? People would have died. The Shagasarya would have given up his life for a shas. He borrowed the shas of the Rebbitzin. The rabbi died of the city where the Shagasari was growing up, and he used to borrow 1 Gemara at a time. She lent him. She wouldn't lend him 2. Only 1 Gemara at a time. That's the way it was. Yeah.
I'm sure it may be that you told me the story. I don't know. Maybe somebody else. I remember somebody who came from Europe, and they lived in a town that had a yeshiva, and the yeshiva did not have a Gemara Zvachim.
Correct. I remember the story.
You told me that story?
Yeah, they didn't have a Gemara Zvachim. It was Reb Yitzchak Inspector, the Kovner Rav. His first position, the Rav called him up. The Rav wanted to retire of this town. I don't even remember the name of the town, but you can find it out. Right? He was a young man, and the Rav said, "We have to talk in learning." Okay? And he told him what the subject is. And Reb Yitzchak Inspector didn't know so much about it because you need a Gemara Zvachim. And he never saw a Gemara Zvachim in his life. Okay, the Kovner Rav, the Rav of Kovner. Okay, never had seen. But he had luck. He came to the home. By the way, my grandfather told me this story, and Reb Yosher Ber Soloveitchik told the same story to Rav Hershel Shechter. Nothing to do with each other. Reb Yaakov said the story, and Reb Yosher Ber said the story independently. And so he comes to the Rav's house, and the Rav tells him what he wants to talk about because he has a certain get that has to be given, and there's a shiloh on the get. Okay? So he says to the Kovner Rav, "But you traveled so far, I want you to rest up a little bit." So he says, "You can go in my study. There's a bed, and I'll close the door. You'll rest up for an hour, and then we'll talk in learning. So he closes the door, and the Kovner Rav sees on the desk a bunch of svarim that are all with simaniot in it, like, pages turned in and little, ptakim in the sefer. So he opens it up and he sees that the Rav has been learning this sugya, and he sees Masechta Zvachim for the first time. So he didn't go to sleep. He sat there, he was learning through Masechta Zvachim. And then when the Rav, when the Rav knocked on the door, he probably lay down in bed for a second, Rav said, you got to get up. We got to schmooze now. So he gets up, and of course, he was an Eloi, the Kovner Rav was an Eloi. So he was able to do a lot in a very short amount of time, right? He started talking to me, he knows the whole sugya. So he got the job. That was his first job. But it wasn't uncommon. It was just.
I heard a different story. The story that I heard of Shurin is that I'm trying to remember. Anyway, some guy came to a small town. He had his zvachim with him. They didn't have his zvachim in the yeshiva, so they put a daf up in the Beis Medrash, and each guy was given like 20 minutes to look at Masechet Zvachim, and they had like a schedule for all night long. Each guy would get 20 minutes to sit and take a look at Masechet Zvachim, and the daf was full because people wanted an opportunity, and they just didn't have his Zvachim in that town.
It's a bit of a different story, but I could certainly believe it. Look, my grandfather told me Slabodka had 575 guys in his time, 575 guys, and he said there was one Reb Kiva Eiger. Okay, now you're talking about a yeshiva, not of, Chappelle's has about 4 or 5 Reb Kiva Eigers. How many guys in Chappelle's can open up a Reb Kiva Eiger? Maybe 5 of the guys, maybe. 575 guys and 1 Reb Kiva Eiger. Okay, so Reb Yaakov said to me, somebody told me that Reb Kiva Eiger asks my question. So I went to get the Reb Kiva Eiger. They said there's a lineup for it. See, he says, you think I waited? I went to the next Gemara already. That's what he said. I went to the next Gemara. It's just a different world, than we have today. Svarim were very expensive. And I'm telling you, if a guy from Eastern Europe would go out to your Geniza, wherever you find those books, his mouth would start watering. He wouldn't even understand it, how you could possibly throw out these svarim, right? But we're living in a world that it's just an unbelievable world, okay? And maybe that's why we don't know as much. Yeah, Rav David Lifshitz told over that a guy came to his town with, what was the name of the sefer? I'm forgetting all my yeshiva svarim from all the years. It wasn't Ktaisis in Shulchan Aruch, but this was hold on 1 second. I think I have. Okay. The Machane Ephraim. In the yeshiva world, that was like one of our Bibles, was the Machane Ephraim, on different sugyas of shlichus and so on and so forth, right? So Reb David Lifshitz said, a guy came to the town where I was living as a kid, and he had a Machane Ephraim. And I've never seen one before. I heard things in his name. I never seen one. So I asked him if I could borrow it. And I stayed up the whole night to read it through. That's what Rav Lifshitz told me. The whole night I stayed up. He knew the guy's going to leave the next day. He has to have the Machane Ephraim. Right? It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. Okay. So here, this fellow, Rav Moshe Shimon Zivitz, right, sent Reb Yaakov his 2 volumes on Yerushalmi, and he was a Yelid Sitivyan, right? Therefore, he sent me the Sefer, but I didn't have a Yerushalmi to write Ha'aris on. I had his Sefer, but was going on a Yerushalmi. I didn't have the Yerushalmi, right? So, I always thought that Reb Yaakov must have been like, a rabbi in the town, and this kid must have been a kid, and then he grew up, and then he, He left Sitivyan. He got married in 1855. Okay, 30 years before Reb Yaakov was born. Okay, he got married, I think, 1855. Okay, in 18. No, he was born in 1855. He was born in 1855. Over 30 years before Reb Yaakov was born. Okay, he left for America. Okay, he left. The Kovner Rav told him to go to America in 1886. 5 years before Reb Yaakov was born. So when it says here it was Elid Sitivyan, right? It was way before Reb Yaakov was born. Okay. So I always had the question when I saw this piece. I always had the question: why is he sending this to Reb Yaakov? He could be Reb Yaakov's father, maybe even grandfather, but father for sure he could be, right? So he was born in Sitivyan. So what, right? You know where he lived in America? I wanted to ask you guys if you ever can find out. He was a Rav in Pittsburgh in 1886. If I'm not mistaken, he became a Rav in Pittsburgh 5 years before Reb Yaakov was born. Okay? And I know about him because he created what's called in America the Agudas HaRabbanim. That was the organization of the old-time Rabbanim. Reb Lezer Silver, Moshe Soloveitchik, and then later on, Reb Moshe Feinstein, Reb Yaakov, Reb Aaron Kotler, right? There were the old-time Rabbanim who were much older than Reb Yaakov and Reb Moshe, right? My father remembers that when he used to go to Agudas HaRabbanim meeting on the Lower East Side, Reb Moshe, Reb Yaakov used to sit in the back of the room. They were sitting in the back with my father, even before my father knew Reb Yaakov. My father heard of Reb Yaakov, but before he was a son-in-law, they were all, the new Rabbanim were all sitting in the back. So Reb Yaakov and Reb Moshe were sitting in the back too, right? That's the Agudas HaRabbanim, because you can imagine they had people like this fellow who was a Choshev Rav, but he was probably, 40 years older than Reb Yaakov and Reb Moshe. So when he was 60, Reb Moshe was 20. Okay? So my point is that that's why Reb Yaakov says he sent the Sefer to me because I'm the Rav of Sitivyan. But he didn't really know Reb Yaakov. Didn't know. Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky, he has a svara that maybe he had children or grandchildren in Sitivyan. And therefore, they told him about their rabbi and he decided to send them svarim. And he probably knew or heard that Reb Yaakov was a Choshev Rav. So he said, write me Ha'aretz, right? Now, Reb Yaakov couldn't write him Ha'aretz, but Reb Yaakov read the Mavo. Because the Mavo you don't need any Yerushalmi for. The Mavo is an introduction, so he was able to read the Mavo. The Ha'aretz, the Chidushim on the Yerushalmi couldn't read because he didn't have the Yerushalmi, right? But he read the Mavo, and that's what he's going to talk about over here. And it's not such an easy piece to read, but we'll try to do it. But that's what Reb Yaakov's talking about over here. Mumar and Meshumid, right? This guy this Rav wrote about this in his Mavo. So he says, Az kosafti lo rak benugei l'masha kosav sham b'Mavo. I wrote him what is relevant to Mavo. By the way, Reb Yaakov did a tremendous amount of learning in Sitivyan. He didn't get enough of salary to stay. But if not for Sitivyan, I don't know if Reb Yaakov would have been as big as he was. He did a tremendous amount of learning because there was nobody home.
How old was he then when he was a Rav then?
He must have been, let's say, about 31, 32, right? And he was a Rav there for 12 years, maybe even a little bit older, maybe 33, 34, and there was a Rav for 12 years there. And then first, he left because he couldn't make a living and went to Canada eventually, went to Toronto, right? But he was a Rav there, I think, for 12 years, and there was absolutely nothing to do there. How many shilas can you get from 38 families, right? And again, they weren't 38 families of B'nai Torah. 38 families in Har Nof or, in Mattersdorf or something, or, in a Beit El. You get shilas all the time. But these guys, they were really, a lot of them, most of them were Balabatim. He had one guy who was a real Yodea Sefer. His name was Reb Shmuel. And he had Amos of the Tzibura. So he never was able to take a job. He had a psychological problem, this Reb Shmuel, a big Talmud Chacham. But no, he didn't have a psychologist to be metapel with him, to cure him. So he never took a job. And he sat with Reb Yaakov and learned. He was Reb Yaakov's Chavrusa. And he was a gigantic Talmud Chacham. Reb Yaakov and his sat and learned basically day and night. They learned slowly with the Rishon and with the Shulchan Aruch through Shas, all of Shas. Right? You can see from his writings how he's writing this Masechta, then that Masechta, and that Masechta. That was it was an unbelievable thing. He said, I remember him saying to my father, in Sitivyano habe ich gelernt ehrlich. I learned honestly. Because I learned the Gemara, the Rashi, I didn't have to say any chidushim. I just learned very honestly. I wasn't forced to say anything, right? Reb Yaakov used to be mechadish when he was forced, but otherwise he kept going, And he learned through then the Rosh, the Rif, the Mordechai, then the Tur, then the Shulchan Aruch, right? He learned through it, right? In order, straight, Anyway, so he says like this. This is the lashon that in other words, Reb Yaakov had the svarim. I don't think he had the svarim by the time he came to America, but I don't remember him having svarim like this. But he had the svarim because it was sent to him. So it says that the fellow wrote Lihavi Yodua Kimatichea Yerushalmi Hechalifu Tevis Hazoros Lanu Lemilos Hamadubaros Bismanenu Laman Yikal Alalomdim Lavinam. The Rev Moshe Shimon wrote, right? The Rav of Pittsburgh, right? Wrote that it's known that the people who wrote over the Yerushalmi, not the original Yerushalmi, but the people used to write it over before there was a printing press, right? You wrote over everything. So the people who wrote over the Yerushalmi used to change words, Tevos Hazoros Lanu, things that were foreign to us, a word that was foreign, they changed. And they changed it to a word that we'd understand. Today, no one would chas v'sholom do such a thing in a Bavli, change a word that we know better, right? No one would do that. But he says the original Matikim used to do it. Okay? The ones for the words that were spoken in our times. In order to make it easier for the Lomdim Lavinam, v'davazel lo ra'av lo yada chover givat, it says givat shul, but she givat Yerushalayim. And this fellow didn't see and didn't know the chover, the one who was mechaber, the sefer givat Yerushalayim. He was a maskil, okay, and that's why he calls him a chover, right? Because he was a mechaber, but a chover usually means a magician, right? In the Torah, she was chover. So he's talking about him being a magical person, right? And not in a good way, by the way. V'diber saral Yerushalmi kulo she'echad akroyim bismanam achronim. He spoke poorly about the whole Yerushalmi. She'echad akroyim, one of the Karaites in the later times, kosvu or ksavo. Ve'viu b'batei midrashos Yisrael ve'hevi rayos. He wrote this and he brought it to batei midrashos Yisrael and he brought proofs that in other words that the Yerushalmi is not the original language. It was changed to be more convenient for the newer readers. V'achas mirayosav min tevas mumar, and one of his proofs is shematzi b'Yerushalmi meshumid. In the Yerushalmi, it said the word meshumit. V'teva azos lo yodu kadmonim. And he says he says that that you don't find the word meshumit in the old days, right? You find the word mumar, right? Vashalem lo midvil yadav. Midvil yadav. I'm not exactly sure, but it could be devil from the word devil. Midvel is from the devil of his hands. Yira poches. Poches is irresponsible person. But Sanhedrin, let the irresponsible person who wrote that the Yerushalmi has a lot of changes, and one of them is because Mumar, he found the old Yerushalmi means is written as Meshumid, right? And he says that the Kadmonenu didn't know this, so he says Perek Gimel Halacha Ches B'Tfusim Zatmir, in the Tfus of Zatmir in the Yerushalmi, in the Tfus Zatamir, V'ritvaz Nemar Chad Mumar Udfus Kurdistan Chad Meshumad. The same Gemara, it says in this Tfus it says Chad Mumar, and one it says Chad Meshumar. Kimdubar Bizmanenu, like in our time. Hare Baalil ki kol echad etik kimdubar Bizmanu v'olpidu al shinei hazeh. Right? This is one of the fellow's proofs that this maskil's proof that you see that there's different usages of mumar and meshumad, right? Sometimes mumar, sometimes meshumad. Ayin shamot masha harich. Haresha kibla Rav Zitvitz et hanocha amutas. Rav Zitvitz accepted the hanacha, means like the what's the word hanacha?
The working
hanacha.
assumption.
The what? The assumption. Good. Hamutas, the mistaken assumption. Shall also chaver upoche shemumar hi amila makoris. In other words, Rav Moshe Shimon accepted this from him, that he's right, that mumar is the original word. That's what Reb Yaakov wrote, Reb Moshe Shimon. That's a mistake. The original is that Meshumid was the real one. And the Maskilim changed it because they didn't want the word Meshumid, because all of them were Meshumadim. That shows you that the original Yerushalmi, right? And if you look at the original Kisvei Yad, you'll see always the word Meshumid. I asked somebody who's a little bit of a scholar, and he said that you see the word Meshumid, v'lo mumar, and you don't see the word mumar. Okay? So anyway, you look in the Yerushalmi, you see the word mumar, it's going to be a later edition. It's not going to be the early edition. But that's what he says, that Reb Moshe Shimon made a mistake by assuming that the fellow was right, that mumar is the original word and meshumid is the later word. He says it's just the opposite. Meshumid was what it said in the Yerushalmi, like it said in the Targum Onkelos, meshumid. And later on, they changed it to mumar to not make it so bad. Vehine, but Birchas HaShacher.
Shurin?
Yeah.
Rav Shurin?
Yeah.
I just want to note that here in footnote to 646, at the end, Rav Yosef mentions what I mentioned last week. He said, "Kmo chen ish leciyin shegam barambam bekisvei yad temani mofia meshumad ba'asrot mekomot shetzlinu b'tfusim mofia mumar."
Excellent point. Excellent
like
point.
I said last week,
You mentioned that they always have the word meshumid, right?
Yeah, their Shmona Esrei says meshumadim lo tikva.
Okay, yeah. So that's the original one, and it could be. I'm not sure. Maybe the Teimanim didn't have a lot of Meshumadim, so they weren't afraid of it. They weren't afraid someone's going to tell the king or something is a Meshumid. In the Christian world, there were a lot of Meshumadim who, ran from their Judaism, became Christians. All the people had the debates, in the Middle Ages were all Jews. Goyim couldn't have those debates. They were all Jews. Those are the worst when you have a Jew like that. Anyway, so Reb Yaakov says that when you take a look, Shalo Asani Goy, right, Besidur Shel Rev Wolf Heidenheim, called Safa Brura, okay, Tov Kuf Pei, it's a very good few hundred years ago. Kosov Shalo Asani Nochri. It says Lo Asani Nochri. Now, there's three things it could say. I think you probably have seen Sidurim of three things. Shalo Asani Goy, Shalo Asani Nochri, V'Shalo Asani Akum. Okay? those are the three. I don't know if you've all seen all three of them, but I have seen them over the last like 50, 60 years in different Sidurim, old Sidurim. Those are the three different options. So we have Shelo Asani Goy, but he says Revov Heidenheim had Shelo Asani Nochri, V'hu Lefi Loshen HaMikra. Now Reb Yaakov is going to be machalik between the Loshen HaMikra and Loshen HaMishnah. Okay? Loshen HaMikra, HaNochri Asher Yavo Me'eretz Rechoka. Right? The Nochri that comes from a foreign land, right? Right? And it uses the word, obviously, Nochri, which means a non-Jew. Right? So the Loshen in the Torah, right? I'll give you an example. I'm just remembering. In the beginning of Sefer Parsha Shoftim, right? Lo sucha latet alecha ish nachri ashol lo meachechahu. Right? You can't make a guy a king, nachri, that's not one of your brothers. So you see the word nachri was used the way we use a guy today, right? Or Shlomo Melech says, if a guy comes to give a carbon, right? Hanachri, he says, right? Ashalom me'amecha, I think it says. Hanachri ashalom me'amecha comes to the Beis Hamikdash. It's very clear that Nachri is being used as you use a guy, because a guy can mean a lot of things, right? It can mean a nation, right? But we use it today as a non-Jew. Not as by the way, a guy could also be the Jewish nation, correct? Right? V'nivrucha, one second. V'eselecha l'goy gadol. I'm going to make you for a big guy. Right? It doesn't mean we're going to be big guy. Goy kadosh, right? 100%. This week's parsha, right? So the point is that goy can mean a lot of different things. But the question is how we're using it. So Reb Yaakov says, Heidenheim wanted to use the Loshen HaMikra. Which, okay, that's very valid. Okay? And he says, Ulam nirash hanusach hamukubal shelo asani goy hu mat'im leloshen chachamim v'hamishna sheishtamshu b'tevas goy k'mila miyuchedes l'eina Yehudi. In other words, where did it start that we started using goy for a real goy and not for Jews anymore? He says in the Tkufas HaTalmud, Tkufas HaMishnah, Tkufas HaTalmud, V'lo k'shem nirdaf l'tevas am. It's not a shame nirdaf for, in other words, an am. Goy is like a goy, like you said, goy kadosh. It means an am. It doesn't mean a particular goy, person. V'zeh ola b'daiti mitargum onkelos ala pasuk b'chumash vayikrav kasher ka es hagoy asher lefnechem shetirgum onkelos kemo the rokanus that God will he'll spit you out. Yas amamaya di kodemecho, right? Asher lefnechem, right? Amamaya, he says, goy is amamaya. Ulachayr a pasuk goy hu lashon yachid. Madia tirgum b'lashon rabin. V'nira shegoy b'lashon kodesh v'chein amamim b'lashon aramis hainu eina Yehudim. In other words, in Aramis, they used always the plural language, amamaya, for what we use for a guy singular. Well, and again, this doesn't mean a guy of a nation. It means a non-Jew. Okay? Hainu ena Yehudim v'lo am v'uma ba'alma. It's not an am and uma ba'alma. Okay? But Rabbi Yaakov is not denying that it's used as both. In other words, in the Chumash, you have goy could be used for a Jew, but it could also be used for a nation, a non-Jewish nation. But Rabbi Yaakov is saying Chazal coined it. What we have Nachri in the Chumash, they decided to use the word goy. He doesn't say why, but he says they decided to use the word goy. And that's where we get the idea today. Rabbi Yaakov is going to discuss it. Varaya miyoma, Amid Aleph, Ayin Aleph Amid Beis. This is the famous story. Tanach Rabbanan. Maisa b'koyin gadol, right? Maisa b'koyin gadol. One second. Yeah. Maisa b'koyin gadol. Echad sheyotza b'beis kodesh hakadoshim. V'havi azli kulei alma basrei. Right. There was a story that the Second Temple Kohanim were not necessarily, Chafetz Chaim, right? They were not necessarily the greatest people or the biggest tzaddikim. So he went out, and they were people. Everybody went after the Kohen Gadol. Came out on Yom Kippur from the Kodesh Kodashim, right? Kevin the Chaziyunuhu, right? L'shmayev Avtalion, right? Since they saw Shmayev Avtalion walking, Shafku l'didei Osli Basir Shmayev Avtalion. They left the Kohen Gadol and they went after Shmayev Avtalion. Okay, so the people knew who the real deal was. You had the Kohen Gadol, who was, choshev, but it came beyond to compare him to Shmayev Avtalion. There was no race here, right? Shmayev Avtalion were much more choshev. They were the real deal. The Kohen Gadol was a political leader, basically. Okay, so you want to get an autograph from Bibi Netanyahu, but if Rav Shach walks past, you leave for a Bibi and you want to get an autograph from the Rav Shach. You don't want to get from a Bibi, right? So it says, L'sof asu Shmayev Avtalion liftu remine. At the end, Shmayev Avtalion, also part of the minyan, went to say goodbye to the Kohen Gadol. Amar lahen, he said to them, he gave anyone who went to say goodbye, he gave them a bracha. Yesun b'nei amamim l'shlom. Go, children of Goyim, in peace. That's what he said to Shmayev Avtalion. Not very nice. Rashi already says that it wasn't. It was using the word. So Reb Yaakov was showing that they used the word in plural, right? Even though it meant for a guy in Aramaic, they always used it in plural. So let the children of Goyim, right? And here he doesn't mean nations; he means the Goyim, because they were bnei Gerim, right? Let them go in peace. Go in peace. He gave them a bracha, but of course it was a bracha with what we call in Yiddish a shtach, a bracha. Why? Because he was angry that everybody went after Shmayev Avtalion and not him, right? You see, he had a problem with his covet, right? Amrullah, so they said back to him, Yesum b'nei amamim l'shlom the avdin uvda the aro. Let the children of non-Jews go in peace, who did the work of Aaron. What does that mean? Oev Sholem v'rodev Sholem. They went to say goodbye to him, even though they were much more chashuv than him. V'lo Yesu bar Aaron. And the bar Aaron, because of course he was a Kohen, right? The Kohen Gadol. L'shlom de lo aviduv did the Aaron. And not to go, the bar Aaron should not go in peace, because he didn't do what Aaron did. He wasn't interested in shalom. You were interested in onas dvarim, in giving me a shtach, right? You're interested in giving us a shtach. You're not allowed to do that. That's the example of the Gemara in Bava Metzia, that you can't call them b'nei Gerim, and he called them b'nei Gerim. So they said to him, "We're going after Aaron in peace, because oev shalom v'rodev shalom. We're the real b'nei Aaron, and you who are mamish b'nei Aaron are not acting like Aaron." Okay? Hare shebnei amamim hu loshin ginai l'goy. That's what he was saying to him, right? Rashi says that, loshin ginai over there. For Odraya, another proof, shahare amila zot goy nichneso miloshin kodesh l'toch sfat Yiddish, right? Of course, we have it today from the sfat Yiddish, right? We call the guy a goy, right? So, and we mean he's not Jewish. We don't mean he's from a nation. Even though when people say, you're calling him a guy, so, all the secular Jews, we say, all guy does is mean a nation. That's all it means. But that's not really what it means here. It means he's not Jewish, right? It doesn't mean necessarily anything terrible, but it means he's not Jewish, right? Goy nichso mit meloshen kodesh letoch svas Yiddish, right? And that's what we say today, goy. Umashmusa tomidhi lemisheni Yehudi. V'nimtza she'atikus milazos himizman golas Ashkenaz. When the Jews first came to Ashkenaz, which I think is probably around the year 400. Okay, in other words, they started speaking Yiddish. Reb Yaakov was maskim that Yiddish didn't come from Sinai, number one. And number two, he's maskim, it didn't come from Eretz Yisrael, right? It came when they came into Germany. They learned the language. Like many languages, there was always a usage of Jewish words in there or Hebrew words, right? In our Yiddish, there's a ton of Hebrew words as well. Sometimes you can't make them out because of the way they're pronounced, but there's a ton of Hebrew words. So he says, Mizman goes, Manda me'or sheichel Yehudim laber b'safa Ashkenazis, v'oz ichnisu mila meloshen kodesh lefi hamuvan shel mila ba'oso zman. They started introducing words because they didn't have a word in Yiddish for a guy. So they borrowed it from Hebrew, right? I remember Shlomo Zalman talking to me, and every now and then he threw in a Hebrew word. And I remember Reb Yaakov talking to me, and every now and then he threw an English word, not a Hebrew word, right? Because for the obvious reason, Shlomo Zalman grew up in Israel, and if he forgot for a second the Yiddish word, he substituted with the Hebrew word. And Reb Yaakov did the opposite. Forgot the Yiddish word, so he brought out the English word. If the English word described it better, he said it, right? So he says that's what happened in Ashkenaz. They didn't have a Yiddish word for a guy, so they used the word guy. It changed from being a nation to being a non-Jew. Okay? It's from the time of the Mishnah. Now listen to this. I remember all the years I couldn't figure this out. Okay? I remember Reb Yaakov had to tell me, right? I couldn't figure it out. In some Mishnayos, I found the word akum, right? At the beginning of Masechta Avodah Zarah, right? Beginning of Masechta Avodah Zarah. 1 second. Beginning of Masechta Avodah Zarah. It says, all through Masechta Avodah Zarah, but the beginning it says, right? Lefnei eidehem shel akum. Here it says akums. Avodas kochavim umazolos. Shloshe yamim asal aseit v'lateit imahem. Okay, before their holidays, right, of the akum. So I always thought it used the word akum because they're over their avodah zarah and their holidays are avodah zarah. So you can't, right? In Baba Kama, for instance, I'll never forget this. It's the first time I ever saw it. Baba Kama, there's Romans who dress up as Jews, and they go learn in the Beis Medrash. And they say, right, and you remember the Gemara says, they say we agree with everything except that Shor Shel Yisrael Shenogach Shor Shel Kenani. Kenani? Where did they get that from? Where did Kenani come from? Right? In other words, all these words are substitutes. If you look at the original Mishnayos, and again, if you look at the art school Mishnayos of today, or the Kahati Mishnayos, it doesn't say Akum anymore. It says Guy. Because that's the original. Check it out if you have a Kahati. But I saw it in the art school. I didn't look in the Kahati, but in the art school I saw it. It's all put back. Everywhere it says Akum, in the Mishnah was Guy. But we didn't think so. We thought maybe that's the right word. But Rabbi Yaakov says, no, that's the censor. Because it's safer to put avodas kochavim, especially in our time. When the printing press, it was safer because there was no more avodah zarah. And to put a guy, they would have gone ballistic. You're printing by an Italian printer or by a Polish printer. The Jews had no right to print. So what are you going to see the word guy? He'll go ballistic on you. So they substituted with any other word they found. They found the word akum. They found the word kanani. Whatever worked. Okay, so that's what he means. Kanireh shahaya shu od mizman hamishna. But I actually wrote Reb Yosef about this, and he right away wrote me. He looked at the Digduke Sofrim, which is the original writings of the Shas, and it all says Guy. All the places that I told him it says Akum or Knani, all says Guy. V'nimtza shaloshin shalo asani Guy hu lefi loshin Chazal. Okay, in other words, when we say shalo asani Guy, we're doing it according to loshin Chazal and not according to loshin HaMikra. Now the question, of course, is why do we do it according to loshin Chazal? Let's do it according to loshin HaMikra. V'ilu shelo asani nachri hu lefi loshen mikra. Okay, and that's what we said. Like lo suchala take ish nachri, right? Ish nachri shelo me'achecha. That's the right word, nachri. Okay, and that's why Heidenheim had the word nachri. But Reb Yaakov is going to make a case that we use lashon chazal and we don't use lashon of the lashon haTorah. But davazeh ima brachas nitkenu b'lashon hamikra o b'lashon hamishna tolui beplukta. There's a machlokes whether when we make brachas, do you make it in lashon hamikra or lashon hamishna? But we have an easy way to know that. Asher kedesharu mitzavet zivanu laniach tefillin. Are we using lashon hamikra? Laniach tefillin? Laniach ot. That's what he's supposed to say. Laniach ot. Right? Laniach totavot. Right? Right. On the shel yad and shel rosh. You put laniach al misvas totava.
The Targum says on totafot tefillin.
Who says?
The Targum Onkelos on totafot says tefillin.
Tefillin, right? So the Targum is again lashon chazal. So we use lashon chazal. Did anyone ever say asher kedesham mitzavet zivanu al litilas kapos tvarim? You're even laughing at it. That's what you're supposed to say. Litilas kapos tvarim. Right? There's many mitzvahs like this that if you check, we're using lulav. Well, in Perek Shlishi, in Masechta Sukkah, it says lulav hagazel. That changed everything, right? Right? So that's what Reb Yaakov was saying. There's a machlokus. Ayin Shulchan Aruch, Yoreh Deah, Siman Shin Chav Ches. Reb Yaakov loves this. This is Reb Yaakov's favorite stuff. Okay? B'shah sheyafrish chal yivorach hasheker sham tzvanu lahafrish truma. Did you know that? And Shulchan Aruch, the Machaber says lahafrish truma al chala. Go tell your wife that. See what she says, right? Va'al zeh kosav Ramah o lahafrish chala. Right? Where does it use the word chala? It does use the word chala in the Torah, but not. It says maybe Rabbi Yaakov will quote it. Title shom chaba adif lashon mikra reishis ariso seichem chala torimu truma. You're supposed to torimu truma. Supposed to take truma. So you say asher kedeshanu b'mitzav v'tzivanu lafrish truma. Right? L'rama adif lashon mishnah u'b'lashon mishnah mavdil ben truma l'chala. Right? In the lashon mishnah, you find the mishnayos on trumas. And you find the mishnayos on challah, separate thing. Even though since we paskin like the Ramah, yesh lanu lom b'lashon chazal shelo asani goy below nachri. That's how he says. Now I asked a Sephardi guy what his wife says. I wrote him, and I asked him what his wife does, and he wrote me back. He's a big Talmud Chacham. He wrote me back here. He actually sent me a picture of his wife's sitter. Asher kedesham mitzav tzivanu lahafrish chala truma. He wanted to get them both in. Lahafrish chala truma. Okay, we just say chala because we use lashon hamishna, and he uses truma because lashon haTorah. Okay. V'kanireh she'emus hatzenzura hitfisu nochri. Okay, and when you find nochri, shelo asani nochri, that's the censor already that did that, because he didn't want that you should have the word guy again, because the word guy implies something negative, right? Ubefarhesya amru nachri mishum sholom malchus al betzina amru goy. Right? In farhesya you say nachri, something that's going to be people are going to see. You say nachri, and people and in sinna you say the word goy because there nobody will hear it. That's what Reb Yaakov says. So Reb Yaakov comes to the conclusion that goy is the correct term, right? And because it's lashon mishnah, right? And Nochri is Lashon HaMikra. And of course, if you say Shlo Asani Ovet Kochavim, which I also saw in some Sidurim, that's of course wrong. Because that's really for the censor. Okay, so now I have to tell you the bad news. Okay, when you get a chance, take a look at the siddur called Baruch She'amar. Okay, so the siddur that my grandfather loves, I told you, it's called Avodas Yisrael. It was written by somebody by the name of Bear. He always says, Kuk's Charain in Bear, Vazok there. He didn't call it he didn't call it Bear. That's what he used to call it. So I always used to look up in Bear siddur. Right? It's a siddur you could buy for dirt cheap. It's an unbelievable siddur, 1 volume, unbelievable siddur. I bought it when I bought it 45 years ago when I came to Israel, I bought it as my siddur, but I didn't always use it. But I bought it for maybe, at that time, it was maybe, but today would be like 10 shekel. It's a siddur, and it's got digduk and everything it's got in there. Okay, so he comes to the conclusion you have to say Nochri, because he says that's more correct than Goy. I don't remember all his shtickle Torah, but he says, one of the things he says, Lashon HaTorah. But Rabbi Yaakov says, Ma'adif Lashon Chazal. You see that the Ramo is Ma'adif Lashon Chazal. So it's Lashon Chazal. But the Baruch She'amar, did you ever hear the siddur Baruch She'amar? There's a commentary on the siddur called Baruch She'amar from Reb Baruch Epstein, the Torah Tamima. He wrote a great work on the siddur. 1 volume work. It doesn't have the siddur in there, it just has his horrors on the siddur. He comes to the conclusion that the best thing to say is Shelo Asani Akum. Exactly what the censor put in. He doesn't say it's a censor, but he tries to prove that Nochri could be used for Jews too, and certainly Goy could be used for Jews too. Reb Yaakov is maskim to him. Reb Yaakov doesn't disagree, but he says the way we use Goy is the way Chazal used Goy. Right? That's not you find in the Torah Goy like Michael said. You find you find Goy Kadosh, right? You find, but he says that's not the way Chazal use it. So he has a whole shtickle Torah there. He first takes apart the word Nochri, then apart the word Goy. And he says you have to say Akum, Sholosani Akum, and Rabbi Yaakov would laugh at him. He would say like, "What are you talking about? That's the real censor." By the way, Rabbi Yaakov held that a woman also says Shelo Asani Goy, because it's not a Lashon Zachar. It means non-Jew. So Reb Yaakov, my mother used to say Shelo Asani Goy. I don't know, what do they say today? What do they teach the kids to say? Goy? Or Goya? I don't know what they teach them today.
I think Goy.
Goy? Shelo
think
Asani
so.
Goy. Just like the men say. What? Shelo Asani. I was just going to say, you're right. Today, they don't wear a shagitz. They use a shagitz for a guy to chassidim today.
That's what they use against the police.
Right, a shagitz means it's from the word sheketz, but in the Yiddish it became a gimel. Shegitz, right? Sheketz and kuf and a gimel are pretty close together, right? All my students always write me, I want to ask a hashgafa question. Not hashkafa, but hashgafa question. They always have the gimel in there, right? A G, hashgafa. And I always write them back. First thing you got to know that it's hashgafa. It's not mishkavayim, it's mishkavayim, right?
Yeah.
So, but I always get so they learn a shiksa, right? A shiksa, a shagitz, and a shiksa, right? That's what they use. It's from the word sheketz, from disgusting, right? Which is a real negative word. There's no question about it. There's a real negative word. Yeah. There was a woman in my school who showed me a website that's called Shiksa in the Kitchen.
Right.
She's a what do you call it? She's an
influencer.
A convert who koshered her recipes, made them kosher, but they made her take it down. People wrote her, you can't keep it up there. Shiksa, because it's a negative word. She didn't know. My student told me she wrote that I mamish didn't know. I thought it's another word for a non-Jew, right? The reason why they called her shiksa, in order they wanted the boys to keep away from her. So that's what they used it, right? Not that it helped so much, but that was the reason why. That was
Shurin.
Yeah.
I was thinking about for Kriyas Yam Suf.
Yeah.
That the pasuk doesn't say Kriyas Yam; it says Bikiyat Yam. But we call it Kriyas Yam Suf. Maybe it's the same idea here that we're opting for Lashon of Chazal maybe over Lashon of the Pasuk.
Could be you're right. Could be you're right. Yeah,
Well,
it'd be interesting to do a study on it. Reb Yaakov
somebody's written about it.
What?
What?
I've seen an article about it.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I see if I can find it. Somebody's written about it. Why it's called Kriyas Yamsuf and not B'Kiyat Yamsuf.
Okay, so again, if you, in other words, if someone wants to do a doctorate on Lashon Chazal, Lashon Torah, and why Chazal changed and when they changed, it'll be a great thing. Because Reb Yaakov never finishes anything. He starts it, but he never finishes. That was his big problem.
I'm sure. I remember the Reb Yaakov says the same chiluk about Lashon, the Ramon, the Lashon of the Machaber, regarding Shmini Atzeres on Parshas Emor and Parshas Moadim.
Yeah.
When it talks about Shmini Atzeres, he says that the difference in Nosach that we have in the Siddur is based upon the same thing, because we say in Shmona Esrei, Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh,
Right.
I think. And the Sfardim say Yom HaShmini HaChag HaTzeret Hazeh, or something. They changed the word order. And he said that difference is the same yesod of Lashon Chachamim as opposed to Lashon Mikra between the Ramah and the Machaber.
Again, I think there's other places too that Reb Yaakov said. I don't remember offhand, but there are other places as well as Reb Yaakov said it. He had this shita, but he never came through with it. He never said, "Okay, I'm writing a thesis on it now, and it'll take me a week. I'll write a thesis on it." He never did that. He just, whenever it came into his head, he wrote it down, and some people put it together, and that's how we got it. Okay, guys, we'll take something new next week, Bezrat Hashem.
Sure,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Kol Tuv.